about your story that reflect your personal beliefs. So, for instance, if you've interviewed someone, let's say you're a documentary maker and you've interviewed someone, you will end up, deciding what footage to use, what do you want to quote them on, what context do you want to put those quotes in, what kind of music do you want to use? Do you not want to use any music? Are you going to cut out the ums and uhs that people have when they're speaking? And all of those things kind of build together to create this uh, you're sharing an opinion, you are contextualizing. And so we need to remember that as journalists, no matter what, we really can't escape uh, the our own beliefs and our own opinions. So um, I think that it's important to recognize that in some circumstances, not only is objectivity impossible, but striving toward objectivity is morally wrong. And so the reason I'm speaking to you is because I think that my story is one of those cases. So uh, last year, after George Floyd was killed, um, the Friday after that happened, a friend of mine invited me to a protest in Richmond, Virginia, which is like an hour and a half away from DC. Um, and To be honest, when I first went, I went more to just kind of check it out and observe. I am and was working as a reporter then, and then to participate in it. And I figured, maybe I can get like a good freelance story out of this. Maybe I'll take some pictures or something. Um, but that was my initial instinct because in journalism school I've been taught so strongly to remain objective. If you're going to cover a story, like don't get involved, don't get like too attached to anyone. You got to stay distant. You got to stay out of the story. But I mean, as I found myself marching with these protesters toward Virginia's capital, very quickly that changed. And the first thing that started to, make me reconsider my objectivity was the just unbelievable police brutality I witnessed. Apparently, Richmond police are just infamously bad at dealing with protesters and just the public in general. But I mean, I was watching completely nonviolent protesters, and I mean people who were like sitting down in the road, like a hippie sit-in type thing, uh, being, I mean, just like beaten over the head with batons, being sprayed with pepper spray. Um, I mean, I saw people get so much mace in their face that they vomited, uh, and so as I was seeing that, I was thinking like, well, shit, like I'm inhaling pepper spray right now. I'm kind of like, it's hard for me to remain objective when I am the target of police violence alongside all of these other protesters because the cops, didn't really care who was press and who wasn't. They were just there to get people off the streets. Um, and then there was one moment, especially like one image that is like burned into my brain. I recall seeing this young girl who was, I mean, probably no older than 18 and like no taller than 5 feet tall. This just like tiny, like 100-pound girl, whose face was just drenched in blood. And she'd been beaten over the head by cops. And I was thinking to myself, how do you how do you remain objective seeing that? How can you I mean, as a person with a moral compass, how can you look at that, see this like little tiny girl who posed no threat to anyone, and who's had her skull cracked open, and think to yourself like, oh, well, there's really two sides to the story. I don't know. I think that that was when the value of objectivity really started to break down for me. Um, and that was when I really stopped being an observer. Um, so I mean, I think it is technically possible to like cover these protests objectively, but I think that for most people with a heart, you know, you see this stuff going on, um, and I mean, even if you're kind of politically neutral, I think that you just it's kind of impossible to not empathize with the people who you're seeing, you know, as the victims of this violence. Um, And so, as the protests continued, um, I would say that the police made it even more difficult for journalists to be objective. I mean, you saw, was Ali Velshi from CNN was arrested, uh, or no, no, got his knee shattered by a rubber bullet while he was reporting. Um, an entire CNN crew in Minneapolis was arrested live on air. I mean, I'm talking about the cameraman, the reporter, you know, the sound guy. Everyone there was arrested because they had refused to move. That was the charge that the police gave anyway. But in reality, I mean, they were broadcasting it live on air, so everyone saw it. The police said, "Hey, move," and then they moved. And the police said, "Hey, we told you to move. Move away." And then they moved away, and then the police came up and arrested them. Um, and so, you know, I wouldn't blame the CNN reporter if, you know, if they said, "Well, we got arrested on air. Like, this is pretty messed up. Like, maybe something needs to change about the police." You know, if they breached objectivity, then I wouldn't really fault them for it. Um, and I think, you know, when the police have such a hostile attitude towards journalists, as we saw over the past year of protests, um, and even before that, even in Ferguson, you know, tons of journalists were arrested. Um, you know, it makes it impossible to have like an ambiguous or an objective reporting stance. You know, because the journalists are grouped in to the rest of the protesters. There's no separation in the eyes of the police, so um, you know, the personal experience comes to the forefront of the reporting. And I guess this really amped up for me the day after I was in Richmond. It was then the Saturday after Floyd's death, and I was a little bit closer to home. I was a little bit closer to where I live. I was in Lafayette Square, which is like right outside the White House um, in DC. And you know, there was a huge crowd of people because the protests just kept escalating and escalating and escalating. Um, I think in large part due to the police response. You know, there was police brutality at protests against police brutality, so naturally more people would come out the next night to protest. Um, and there was this massive crowd outside the White House. Um, And you know, when I showed up, it was fairly calm and peaceful, but the atmosphere of the protest gradually began to change, and there was this sort of cycle that the crowd and the police started going through where someone would get a little bit too close to the police, they'd be shouting in their face or something. The police would yell, "Back off," and the person would yell, you know, "Fuck you." And then the police would start pepper spraying that person. And in the process, they would also pepper spray 10 other people because it's you know, it's a big misty cloud, so it gets all over the place. Um, and and then that would anger more people who would then come up closer to the police and be more confrontational and more aggressive. And then the police would become more confrontational and more aggressive. Um, and so, you know, I got totally caught up in this. I was watching, you know, all of this happen, and I I think at this point I still had some idea that I was going to write a story or something, but I knew that it wasn't going to be a traditional like uh, very straight, objective news story. But at some point, I got directly pepper sprayed in the face from like maybe a yard away, and it was my skin was so saturated with it that that, like my skin was burning, and usually it's only supposed to make like your eyes and your nose and your mouth burn, but basically, I mean, it felt like someone had dumped acid on my head, and uh, and this kept going on all night. I kept getting pepper sprayed. Several times, I was getting pepper sprayed when I had my hands up. Um, and uh, and I just kept seeing nonviolent protesters getting hurt, getting pepper sprayed. Eventually, they started deploying tear gas. Um, and Speaking of which, as the tear gas was being deployed, this is when things got really wild. Um, I I saw this big crowd rushing away from St. John's Church, which is also near the White House, where there had been an encampment of homeless people who were kind of taking shelter from all of the chaos, right? And the police were throwing flashbang grenades. And for those of you who don't know, they're basically like these uh, little hand grenades. Basically, they're designed to be like non-lethal, but they basically stun you. They make this really, really bright flashing and this very loud banging sound, hence the name flashbang. Anyway, but they were throwing these flashbang grenades into the homeless camp where there were, both people, both protesters and homeless people were kind of like trying to take sanctuary, literally in a church, in a sanctuary. Um, and all of a sudden, the police, started charging it. So people started running away like in mass. And I mean, I've been to a lot of protests in DC before this, so I was thinking like, oh man, people are like gonna get trampled. And sure enough, I saw this old homeless couple, like struggling to like even like stay on their feet as people were like, pushing past them. So, I start going toward the crowd, and I'm like, hey, 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 and I have like my hands up, and I'm saying, walk, don't run, walk, don't run, trying to like calm people down so they don't like, cause a stampede and start trampling old people. Um, and Unfortunately, the police did not respect my commitment to orderliness and nonviolence. And the next thing I heard was a deafening boom and a blinding flash of light, and then I was on the ground, and I like my ears were ringing. I was completely like literally like blind and deaf, and so I'm just kind of like on my knees on the ground, like totally disoriented, and this like little like 17-year-old skater dude comes up to me, and he like he like grabs my arm. He's like, dude, we got to get out of here. And like I can't really hear him because my ears are still ringing from the explosion. And he he kind of drags me away, and he's like, yo, so a flashbang exploded directly on top of your head. And and then I kind of touch my head, and I look down, and there's burnt hair all over my hand and blood, and I'm looking at my arm, and there's like little bits of like plastic and metal shrapnel embedded in my arm. And uh uh and the first thing I could actually hear this guy like say clearly was, he goes, dude, you look badass. and and it wasn't that I looked cool. It was just that my hair was burnt, so I looked like that picture of Einstein with his hair out. Um, and I don't know. I didn't really understand what was going on, and he kept trying to tell me like, "Hey, you need to get medical attention. Like you're bleeding. Like I think you might have hearing damage. There's shrapnel inside of you, stuff like that." And I I was completely disoriented though, so I was not listening, and I was like, no, no, we need to tell people that they need to walk and not run. And they uh, and bless him, he was like, it's okay, I'll have my friend tell people not to run. and he kind of got me to sit down, and uh, eventually my friends came up and found me, and uh, I actually ended up staying out there. I probably should have gone to the hospital, but I ended up staying out there for a couple more hours. Um, and I I didn't, I felt like I had a duty to be out there. And at this point, I was done, thinking I was going to write a story because, at this point it was completely personal. And uh, I didn't think that, I still held on to the value of objectivity. And I thought that, maybe it would be better if I just didn't write a story because I can't remain objective. I'm not going to be able to, even have a remotely unbiased a view of this. Um, but as I stayed out there, I I realized that being on the ground can really change your perspective as a reporter. Nowadays, a lot of journalism is not like traditional, like shoe leather journalism. You do it over the phone, you interview people over Skype or Cisco WebEx, and you are kind of distanced from the story. But when you're out there and you're breathing in the tear gas, it's a lot more personal. Um, and and then when you see the reporting that does come out, when you see the journalism uh, that does come out after these events, you start to put two and two together and see where people's biases are. Because in a lot of right-wing media, um, that night of protests in DC was portrayed as though the protesters had come and somehow like very intentionally like instigated the police to violence when it was really kind of the opposite that happened. And one of the things that more right-wing media pointed to was the fact that protesters had built barricades. But I happened to be there when they were building the barricades, and to right-wing media, this was the pinnacle of lawlessness and chaos. They were showing these pictures of people wearing, black masks, carrying materials to build barricades, and um, they um, um, I don't know. There was this sense that sorry, one moment. Let me think. There was this sense that you were you were seeing you were seeing something that was going to be misreported. You felt like you were going to see something um, on the news the next day that was going to be inaccurate, and that's exactly what happened. Because the reason that people started building the barricades was to keep themselves away from the police. Um, but and this is something that the police ended up doing just a few weeks later. Uh, by the time the protests had um, amped up, they had um, they constructed these big chain link fences outside of the White House uh, to uh, to kind of make sure that protesters and police would have a physical barrier between them, because it became clear that that was the only way that you were going to prevent the police from being violent to the protesters, or vice versa, was to have a physical barrier. And when the protesters made the physical barrier, they were called lawless, they were called, anarchists, they were called destructive. But when the police did it, they were called, heroic for keeping the peace. So, and you just kind of started to see how this media narrative builds up, and you see it build up from the ground where you are to seeing it in the newspaper the next day. Um, so yeah, and I think that it really changes your perspective on objectivity to see the narrative get built like that, because you realize that, you know, reporters really aren't capable of being objective, you know? They all have their biases. We all have our own beliefs. We all have our own experiences. And no matter how hard we try, that ends up influencing the story that we tell. So that's all I have. I can open it up to Q&A now, unless you want me to keep rambling.
Well, I'm sure we could just keep listening to you, but make sure people know you can use that Q&A to ask questions. And I already have several, so I can start out here a little bit. So one of them, you mentioned that you felt like you had a duty to be out there. So I wonder if you would speak to
Sure.
duty to whom, because you can think about, in journalism, we often think about a duty to the public writ large to cover things and give them information. You can think about, as I think you were speaking about, a duty
Yeah.
to a set of people you saw being treated differently than another set. And you could probably also argue a duty to friends and family to go home safe at the end of the night. There are all sorts of duties that are out there. So I just wonder if you would
Sure.
speak to that a little
Sure,
bit.
sure, sure. So the initially the duty I felt was one of a journalist. I felt like I needed to, share what was going on and show the world. But then very quickly that kind of fell to the wayside as I realized that, that this was being recorded by everyone. All the protesters who were there recording it. Most of the police at this by the time these protests happened were already wearing body cams. News cameras were there. So I felt like, the story was already being told. So, the duty that I felt as a reporter felt like it was far less important than the duty I felt as a human being with a moral compass to to just participate in what's going on, and to stand up for what I think is right. Um, and you did mention, there's also a duty to come home safe, and to not, don't get your head blown off by a flashbang. But I think that's important too. But I think the primary duty that was driving me was just that of a citizen of this country who was seeing what was going on. Um, and that's the point that I felt like I had to join things. And after I was done, after I had kind of given up on the idea of attending these protests as a reporter, I started being a medic actually. I started wearing like medic gear and taking medical supplies and helping people who had been, pepper sprayed and shot with rubber bullets and things like that. And that was kind of the role I played most of the time moving forward.
I am going to, we have a question that I'll read to you here in just a
Sure.
second, but also I am going to unmute participants so that they can ask their questions
Hmm.
vocally if they want to, but just to let everyone know, it unmutes all of you at once. So then you'll have to mute yourselves en masse unless you're asking a question. I don't have a way to selectively do that. So I will do that right now. So everybody should now be unmuted and you can selectively change that. But a question we have in chat right now, this is someone who said, I also participated in a BLM protest in LA, which was also very intense, so I can definitely relate to your experience. My question is, if you could do it all again, would you, and would you do some things differently?
Yeah, I would have carried some more medical supplies the first few nights. But I would have absolutely done it all again. I think that, uh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't really have anything that I regret about it. The only thing I would say I honestly regret is that I didn't become more involved earlier. Um, because I think that this idea that I was going to be, some sort of like, super objective reporter who was just going to kind of casually observe and then write a completely unbiased story. I think that that idea kind of prevented me from acting in a more moral way. It kind of prevented me from taking action when I felt like, I would have otherwise had a moral duty to do so.
Okay. Veronica, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, I do. I do. I do. Actually, and I'm curious how, if you had been on assignment for a traditional media outlet and you had to file something. I mean, it also sounds like it got to the point where would have been physically difficult for you because you were injured to
Yes.
file a story. But if
Yeah.
you had to file a story and knew you had an editor on the other end who had expectations of objectivity, what kind of story would you have filed?
I don't know if I would have been able to, not just for physical reasons. I think I would have written a story. Hi, Mom, by the way. Uh, I would have written a story, but it would have, I think, probably been biased to an extent that my editor wouldn't have published it. Um, I mean, unless I wrote for, a publication that was just allowed me an incredible degree of freedom in what I wrote. But I don't think that I could, after seeing the things I saw, I don't think that I could write a story that would be objective enough for like a mainstream publication to print.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Do you think you could have pitched it as an opinion piece instead of writing a straight news article, that you could put an opinion piece that would have ended up on the opinion pages?
Yeah, but usually, I mean, there are exceptions, but more often than not, the people who are published in opinion pages are, experts of some kind or leaders. They're not just, random journalists gone astray. Um, maybe it could have been an opinion piece, but I mean, that is kind of what ended up happening. I wrote an article that got published by a like super local publication um, about my experiences there. But yeah.
Thanks.
So Will, how, you said you emerged both committed to objectivity, which is the part of you that walked away from treating it like you were a reporter.
Mm.
But you also said, reporters in that situation, when really understanding and being immersed in it, can't be objective. So where is the path for mainstream media, whatever the term might be, to cover things like this in a way where they really understand it, if understanding it compromises objectivity?
That's a good question. Well, as we know, mainstream media is more profitable, successful, and trusted than ever. And I think that the reason for that, or the reason that they obviously aren't, um, is that uh, they they have very most mainstream publications or news channels or whatever have a very clear bias, but they pretend to be objective, and I think that it's the dishonesty about that or the misunderstanding between them and the public that causes that lack of trust. So I think that if I were the CEO of some mainstream news outlet, I would say like let's just be frank about the biases that we have. Let's not call ourselves fair and balanced. Let's just say okay, we are unapologetically whatever we are. Have the reporters say what they believe, and understand that at the end of the day, every story is coming from a storyteller who has their own opinions, beliefs, and experiences.
Will, this is Spoon. So just and I don't just say Spoon. This is not really a question. I don't want to answer that if you don't want to answer this.
Sure.
But I'm trying to. What I'm trying to do is ask if you were talking to someone, a journalist who
Yeah.
believed in objectivity,
Yeah.
you're going to have a conversation with that person about objectivity. How would that conversation go?
Well, I mean, I do believe that there is a degree of objectivity that is possible. So I'm just trying to clarify, the position I'm going into this conversation in. Um, but I don't think that that the ideal that we're kind of taught to strive for in journalism school is really something that's achievable, except for the most kind of mundane stories that the reporter might be apathetic about. Maybe like a city council meeting for a town 2 towns away that you don't care about. Um, I don't think I think that if you have any kind of personal connection to a story, and I mean any kind of personal connection, then uh, you're already in a position where your objectivity is questionable at best. And if I were speaking to someone who was a really strong believer in objectivity, I would start off by telling them that, and I'd be interested to hear a more fleshed out defense of it than what I've heard before. But uh, I just don't. I just don't see how we can get around this issue.
So
I'm one popping up here. Where did that go? How have multimedia tools added or not added objectivity in terms of journalists?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. So I think in some ways, you know, the advances in technology and media presentation have added a degree of objectivity. For instance, you can, this is an excellent example with George Floyd. We saw the video that came out of him, being killed, and it sparked immediate outrage because it was essentially an objective record of uh, of what had happened, and allowed people to see uh, the truth of what had happened and know that it was not a filtered perspective. They knew that this was the raw truth of what had gone down. However, later, especially before the Chauvin trial, the police also released different angles of footage and different, they were cut a little bit differently. So, and they kind of told a different story. So, you still have this essential problem that the person recording the event is coming from a certain angle, and ultimately ends up presenting the footage or or multimedia or whatever in a certain way, and so you still have this kind of fundamental issue that the storyteller is affecting the story.
I wonder if you could talk a second about what your decisions when you were out there to kind of cross that line have meant and will mean for your career trajectory. They were choices in that moment, but
Yeah,
also probably choices that have carved out certain areas of
yeah,
coverage.
for sure.
And I noticed some of your freelance work is for a science publication, so
Yeah.
a very different area, but
Yeah, fortunately, the science reporting that I do is largely unrelated to these sort of extremely political issues. Although it does seem like every day science becomes more and more political. Um, but you're absolutely right that when you kind of make the decision to, I won't say drop the pretense of objectivity, but when you make the decision to become like very directly involved in a story, let's say it like that, um, you have kind of put your cards on the table, and you are probably limiting your career publications. I'm sure that One American News Network won't be hiring me anytime soon after reading this story that's sympathetic to the BLM protests. Um, but I'm okay with that. My moral compass is a certain way, and I wouldn't want to work for any place that isn't okay with me telling the truth as I see it. And I want to clarify something here. I think that there is there is objectivity and then there is truth, and sometimes those are not necessarily the same thing. Sometimes being distant from a story and intentionally taking yourself out of it uh, makes it less makes your reporting less honest. And I think that that's it's kind of the heart of what I want to say.
I like that, the truth and objectivity distinction.
Yeah.
Have a question in chat. Have you written stories in the past based on principles of objectivity that you believe had an impact because they were objective?
Have I written Oh, so you're asking, have I written stories where I felt that I was, or that I was trying to be objective and that it had a better impact because I was trying to be objective? Sure.
Correct. That's
Okay.
my
Yeah. So, it's a good question because it's one of the big arguments that I see in favor of attempting to be objective, at least, is that you gain a kind of wider audience of people uh, who are more likely to respect you because they think that you're really trying to get to like uh, the real the real facts of the matter, regardless of your personal opinions. Um, but we live in such hyperpolarized times that I think that the power of that has kind of disintegrated somewhat. I think that you know I won't go through any specific examples, but there are plenty of examples of reporters who have done a very, very, very good job of backing up everything that they try that they're saying, uh, of reporting the facts and finding tons of evidence and being as objective as they possibly can. And then their story is simply, brushed aside by, people of whatever political belief or whatever because it just disagrees with their worldview. And so and we live in an era in a time that is so hyper saturated with different perspectives and different information that even the most even the most well-researched story, even the stories that I'm really proud of, that I really tried to be objective for, I think that their reach and their impact is really limited. Um, and I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. I think that's definitely a mixed bag. But it just means that for our stories to have the kind of impact that we often want them to as journalists, we need to accept that we're just not going to be able to get all or most people on board with the story. A lot of people are just going to be dismissive because of their biases. Um, and it doesn't mean that it's never good to strive for objectivity, but it does mean that it's an increasingly limited tool.
the question here. Have you realized looking back at your own work that you weren't as objective as you thought you were at the time?
Oh yeah, for sure. Especially stuff when I wrote when I was, much younger. Yeah, and I'm sure. I mean, I feel like looking back at any work that you've done for anything, I mean, whether you're a writer or an artist or whatever, looking back at stuff you've done like more than like 3 years ago, um, is often like you just have this experience of like, man, this is terrible. What was I thinking? How did I ever let this see the light of day? But yeah, no, there have certainly been stories I've written where, I thought I was being very unbiased, or I thought I was backing up points well, or whatever, and then I've looked back at them often like while applying to jobs and trying to get like a portfolio together or something, and then realized like, oh my God, this is like I can't ever show this to anyone. So yeah, I've certainly had that experience.
So what is next? Where do you go with your experiences both in newsrooms and out on the streets and putting all that together? And what would be your ideal job? What elements of journalism, if any, would it contain, and what elements of other things?
All of the elements of journalism except for the stringent adherence to objectivity. So I love gathering information. I love trying to get to the truth of things. I love research and interviewing people, and I love all elements of journalism except for this idea, which I think is a little bit outdated and unrealistic, that we have to separate ourselves from the story. So I very much admire. There's a long tradition of more subjective journalism. Whether that be like Hunter S. Thompson or anything like Green wrote, where you have reporters really embedding themselves in the story, and then using their experience as a way to kind of like leverage the information and convey it in a way that I think is often more truthful and more impactful than traditional objective journalism is.
Do you think you could win that argument with your father?
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, he was a fan of Green. So he might. I mean, he might have. I don't know. I guess. I think that he was certainly an adherent to objective journalism too, though. I think he'd be of two minds on it. Yeah.
Yes, when it's your own child, it does tend to open you up to thinking about things.
Well, he was also a writer too,
Yeah.
and a journalist. So
Yeah.
depends on what mindset he was in at the moment, I'm sure.
Have a question, and we're almost at the end of our time here, but a question about how people can follow your work. Is writing in particular places that people can follow, or here, there, and
Man, buy a subscription to WE&T magazine, the premier water, environment, and technology magazine out there. No, you can look me up on Twitter. Just type in my name, William Fowler. I never use Twitter though, so yeah, I don't know how people can follow me. That's a great question. I should use my Twitter more often.
Okay, any final questions out there in the
Anything you want to
chat
say?
Q&A? If not, I think we'll give Will the last little bit here to just wrap up with any final thoughts. And if you have any, I know you weren't expecting me to ask that, but if you come to any grand conclusions after this 45 minutes or so.
If you're male, you should wear a cup to protests, because I've been hit in the groin with a rubber bullet. So just consider packing, and reconsider objectivity. That's all.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And I want to remind others that there is one more session today at 6 o'clock tonight. Will be the Pausies, which is the pet film First Amendment competition. So we had students, and I think they were all students, who submitted short videos with their pets celebrating the First Amendment, and there was voting, and there will be an awards online presentation at 6 tonight. And then tomorrow is the First Amendment Institute, which is 3 50-minute sessions with some national scholars using current events to talk through some First Amendment cases, First Amendment issues, some really fantastic speakers coming in who we might not have had, kind of like Will. You probably wouldn't have come back to Ames for this, but we've been able to get some people who live on coasts and things to come in. So all that's available on the Greenlee website. And again, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you so much, Will, for being willing and for having such a great discussion.
All right, thank you. Have a good one.
All right.